very good conference, lots of good talks, and lots of fun in the evening, pisco sours, all very good. So thank you. Okay, my talk is knowledge norms are bad for us. Here's a plan. In fact, I don't really have sections, but this will give you some idea what I'm going to be talking about. I'll talk about norms of knowledge. I'll explain how they hinge on, the arguments for them hinge on lottery propositions. I'll say there's a big problem with these norms. I'm going to compare the issue with the heuristics and bias research, Kahneman and Tversky, Nesbitt and so on. I'll talk a little bit about statistical evidence and the law, which is closely bound up with this issue. And then I'll argue that knowledge is irrelevant to things in general. So that's the rough plan. Okay, so maybe this is not a big issue in Latin America. We haven't had any talks about this this week, but in certain areas, certainly in Britain, but in elsewhere, a lot of work in epistemology is concerned with norms of knowledge. So there's a paper by Tim Williamson, Phil Review in the mid-90s, arguing that the norm of assertion is a knowledge norm. The norm is that you must assert P only if you know P. Associated with that norm of assertion, some people have defended Williamson, gestures at it, Sova has defended it, a norm of belief, a knowledge norm of belief. You must believe P only if you know P. And others have defended a knowledge norm of action. John Hawthorne and Stanley wrote a paper together arguing that you must treat P as a reason for action only if you know P. And my aim today is going to be to persuade you that these are not good prescriptions, that we should not embrace these norms. They're bad advice. That's my view. But perhaps I should say that in the background, I'm not going to talk about this, there's a big issue about whether the notion of knowledge is important for epistemology. Maybe we should just do epistemology thinking about belief and degrees of belief and truth and reliable sources of true belief and not worry about knowledge at all. There are other people who think that the notion of knowledge, the category of knowledge is central to epistemology. I'm very much of the former school myself, but I won't be arguing that generally. I'm just going to be arguing specifically about these knowledge norms. This is kind of work in progress. I'm not quite sure how to do all this. I've got quite a lot of material. I might have to skip as we go along. So I'd be grateful towards the end for any suggestions you have about how to do this better. Okay, it'll be useful to set up the issues by comparing those knowledge norms with possible alternative norms of assertion, of belief, of action. So we had the knowledge norm of assertion. Here's a couple of different norms of assertion, putative norms, possible norms we might follow. There's a truth norm of assertion, possible truth. Assert P only if it's true that P. Or an evidence norm of assertion, assert P only if you have sufficient evidence that P. Okay, for a bit I'm going to be focusing, just to keep things under control, on norms of assertion. I'll compare the knowledge norm of assertion with the truth norm and the evidence norm of assertion. But the points I'm making will generalize to a certain extent to the belief and action norms as well. Okay, so we have a knowledge norm of assertion, a truth norm of assertion, an evidence norm of assertion. Which is the one that we practice? Which is the norm that really governs our practice of assertion? Now, in most cases, for most kinds of assertion, most kinds of proposition, e.g., my car is parked around the corner, it's not obvious which of these norms we respect in our esoteric practice. And that's because these three norms will lead to pretty much the same assertions. And that's because for normal propositions like my car is around the corner, if you take there to be sufficient evidence for P, you'll take P to be true, and you'll take yourself to know that P, and vice versa. Those three attitudes on your part, that there's good evidence for P, sufficient evidence for P, that P is true, that you know P, will all go hand in hand. So people will generally, in their esoteric practice, respect all three norms at the same time. You say, hang on, but they aren't quite the same norms. What about, rather than seeing what people do, let's see how we criticize them. After all, look, you can have good, sufficient evidence, evidence that warrants belief, and yet, be in a position to respect the evidence norm, but by bad luck, perhaps, your belief isn't true, and then you won't be respecting the truth norm. And even if you do have good evidence and your belief is true, you might not be respecting the knowledge norm. So I've got evidence my car's parked around the corner, I left it there, but it mightn't be true. A burglar might have come and stolen it. And in fact, it might be true, and I have good evidence for it, but in fact I don't know, because the burglar stole it and was so disgusted by it that they put it back where it was, and now my belief the car's around the corner is both true and supported by good evidence, but it's a Gettier case. We wouldn't think I know it. So we might ask, well, in the case where I'm in a Gettier case, say, and I violate the knowledge norm but not the other two norms, do we criticize people? We say you shouldn't have said your car's around the corner because the thief put it back, and so on. Well, we could see which norm we're respecting by seeing whether we criticize people in that case. But in fact, that doesn't really work, because even if the norm were the norm of knowledge, and you shouldn't be asserting it in the Gettier case, we wouldn't really criticize people in that case. We wouldn't say you shouldn't have said my car's around the corner because all this funny business was going on, because it's excusable. Even if you're supposed to know in order to assert it, it's excusable that you asserted in this case, because how are you supposed to tell that you didn't know? So once an assertion is backed by sufficient evidence, we won't really criticize people who make the assertion. And so it'll be unclear whether the norm operative is you should only assert when you have evidence, or whether the norm is the more demanding norm, that you should only assert when you have truth, but in fact we don't criticize people when unluckily the thief has stolen their car, their belief isn't true. Or is the norm that you should have knowledge, but again we don't criticize people if they fail to have knowledge because they're in the Gettier case. So when we look at normal propositions, like my car's parked around the corner, it's very hard to tell which of those three norms are the ones that we are respecting. Okay, but the situation's quite different when we come to lottery claims. And because of this, the people who want to defend the knowledge norm over the other two norms tend to focus many of their arguments, most of their arguments, appeal to lottery claims. So here's a lottery claim. I bought a ticket in a million ticket lottery, £1 million prize, £1 ticket, and let P, this is the lottery proposition, be my ticket won't win. Okay, we can take it that this claim is true. I mean, there's only one winning ticket in a million tickets. And it's true precisely because there's overwhelming evidence for it. But do you know your ticket won't win? And the first thought everybody has is, no, you don't know your ticket won't win. Nothing really distinguishes your case from the one special case where the ticket does win. I'll come back to the question in passing in a while of do you really not know that your ticket won't win? But let's agree that we don't know that. I'll give an explanation for why that's the right line to take on this case in a while. So I'm not going to query that we don't know the lottery proposition. In fact, all my arguments will hinge on the fact that we do not know the lottery proposition. Okay, now note that alongside the fact that you don't know the lottery proposition, it does seem definitely wrong to assert it. If you said, here's a quote from Williamson, crucial quote from his original article. On merely probabilistic grounds, I assert to you, flat out, your ticket did not win. Intuitively, my grounds are quite inadequate for that outright unqualified assertion. It does seem quite wrong to assert, despite the fact that let's take it as true, and you've got overwhelming evidence, despite that it seems wrong to assert the claim that your ticket won't win. There's no question of you're being excused for the assertion in this case because you had such strong evidence. We feel you shouldn't assert something if you don't know it. And so lottery propositions, unlike normal propositions like my car is parked around the corner, argue that the norm governing assertion is the knowledge assertion norm rather than the truth assertion norm, the evidence assertion norm. I mean, even if you have overwhelming evidence for P and it's true, that seems to no way to warrant your asserting it. Or indeed, to go back to the other norms, to flat out believe it or to base some action on it. You might worry about, is it wrong to base some action on it? But Hawthorne and Stanley take it that in this case, right, I got this lottery ticket and I bought it, and then this afternoon I threw it away. And why did you throw it away? Oh, because it won't win. They say that's irrational. You can't throw it away because it won't win if you don't know that it won't win. So they feel that acting is just like asserting. You can't really act on this proposition in the lottery case, even though it's 9999 to 1, because you don't know it. You might think, hang on, why are we focusing on this very special case of a lottery? Literal lottery propositions, they're rather rare, they're unusual. But in fact, many ordinary real-life propositions have just the same structure. The crucial structure is that one's confidence in them derives from bare statistical evidence. It's often called bare statistical evidence, naked statistical evidence. There's nothing to discriminate the case at hand from the very rare exception where the claim is false. And many ordinary real-life propositions have just the same structure. There's the proposition my car's brakes are working, that I won't have a heart attack this afternoon, that my house didn't burn down while I was at work. Imagine all these propositions are backed by the statistics overwhelmingly, but you don't have any special information that distinguishes your case from, let's say, 1 in a million case where people do have a heart attack, where their car's brakes don't work. And in these cases, similarly, just like the literal lottery proposition, it seems that you don't know that your brakes are working, you don't know you won't have a heart attack. And again, it seems intuitively wrong to assert these things, or to flat out believe them, or to base your actions on them precisely because you don't know them, even though they're no doubt true and you have overwhelming evidence. Okay, so that's the standard argument for these knowledge norms of assertion, belief, and action. Look at lottery propositions. They're backed by evidence. They're no doubt true, but even so, it seems wrong to assert them, believe them, act on them. Okay, let's unpick this argument a little bit. Note that it involves two premises, both of which so far are being backed just by appeal to intuition. First premise is that we don't know the lottery propositions, despite the fact that they're 9999 to 1. And the second premise is because we don't know them, we shouldn't assert them or believe them or act on them. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue against the second premise here. I'm going to argue that it's a very bad thing not to assert them, believe them, act on them, even though they're not known. But I'm not going to query the first premise. I'm going to agree that in these cases we don't know the lottery propositions. Now, I know that I've given versions of this talk before, and people have said, hang on, why don't we just accept that we do know the lottery propositions? Now, I actually don't think this is the way to go. I mean, I'll say some things later that I think show that the idea that we don't know lottery propositions, that bare statistical evidence isn't sufficient for knowledge, is deeply embedded in our concept of knowledge. And because of that, to deny, that we don't know lottery propositions, to say we do know lottery propositions, to my mind, is effectively just eliminating, discarding the concept of knowledge. Having said that, I'm happy to grant that if we could bring ourselves to hold that lottery propositions are known, I think that'd be a bit weird, then my objection to the second premise, the endorsement of knowledge norms, would fall away. I mean, in effect, we'd end up in the place I want to get to, i.e. embracing norms that don't place any special weight on knowledge as opposed to truth and sufficient evidence. If you think truth and sufficient evidence is enough for knowledge, well then you're not saying we want a norm that isn't satisfied by truth and sufficient evidence, which is where I want to get to. But still, having said that, I don't think this is the way to get there. I don't think you've really got the concept of knowledge anymore, for reasons I'll explain, if you say that lottery propositions are known. Okay. So, what I've shown so far is that the standard way of defending knowledge norms over the alternatives is specifically by reference to what they say about lottery propositions. It's here where the knowledge norms, but not the alternatives, rule out assertion, belief, and action. And intuitively, I take it, they seem right. They seem right to do so. But I'm not going to argue that, despite this intuitive plausibility, these norms are seriously problematic. Okay, in order to show that, I want to think about a variant lottery case. Okay, good. Same setup. We've got 1 million tickets. But now you've got your ticket, and you read the winning number in the newspaper. And actually, you get to be excited. The first 4 digits are okay, but in the last 2 digits, oh dear, I didn't get there. And now I take it the natural thing to think is that now you know that you didn't win. You've seen in the newspaper. Okay, but newspapers aren't perfectly reliable. Suppose let's cook up this case that this paper is not hugely reliable. I mean, it's not bad, but once every 2 years, the typesetter nods off and types the last 2 digits at random. Okay, so it's possible that you won. It's a 1 in 100 chance. Is that right? That you won, given the first four digits, but only 1 in 100. So there's a 99 to 100 assurance that you know that you lost. So you read in the paper's normally, it's like somebody telling you, normally that's all fine, now and then it goes wrong, but in the case where the typist doesn't nod off, right, the information about the winning ticket is transmitted to you, and you know you've lost. So the advocates of the knowledge norm of assertion, I mean, they don't want to say you only assert when kind of any possibility of mistake is completely ruled out, has become impossible. I mean, they don't want to have such high standards of assertion as that. So they'll be perfectly happy for you to assert in this newspaper case that your ticket lost. It's not bare statistical evidence anymore. You have very specific evidence from the newspaper, which nearly always is right, that your ticket lost. And so that seems right. I mean, you read in the paper, when my ticket lost, you throw it away. Before you read the paper, it was certain that you didn't know that you lost. Bare statistical evidence doesn't give you knowledge. And so you shouldn't say that you lost, because I mean, this is how the knowledge norm people think. Before you read the paper, it was certain that you didn't know, so you shouldn't assert it. Now, chances are overwhelming that you do know, and so you can assert it. But notice how weird this is, right? The claim that you weren't allowed to assert and now are allowed to assert was much more likely to be true when you weren't allowed to assert it. And now that you are allowed to assert it, it's 10 times less likely. And you might well wonder, how can it be a good idea to have a norm that prevents you from asserting in the case where it's one chance in a million that you're wrong, and is I've got the sums right. You can't assert it where it's one chance in 10,000 that you're wrong. So somehow this knowledge norm is stopping you asserting things when it's a really sure thing, and allowing you to assert when it's a rather less sure thing. And that doesn't look like a good thing for a norm to be doing. And again, this isn't just about funny cooked up lottery cases. There are plenty of real life cases like this. Points general. So suppose I get a car mechanic or a doctor or a passerby to check my brakes or my heart or the condition of my house. I mean, but these informants, they could forget, they could muddle up my car with something else, and the chance of the proposition that my brakes are working, I'm not going to have a heart attack, being true might well have gone down. But the knowledge norm of assertion says now it's fine. Now it's fine to assert. You've got a witness who's kind of transmitting information about your house, your heart to you. You aren't just going on bare statistical evidence. So in Tim Williamson's original paper, he does address this issue. I mean, very smart guy, and he is worrying that just this kind of case, his norm seems to be preventing assertion, where it's allowing assertion in a case where the probability of your claim being true is less. And he has a rather funny answer. He says, look, relative to what is the probability less? And he says, look, we should be doing all the probabilities here based on probabilities relative to what you know. And so in the good case, where the typist didn't knob off, you do know, and relative to that, it's certain that you lost. And so it's not true, when we do the probabilities right, that the thing you're now allowed to assert is less likely than when you weren't allowed to assert it. And we might come back to this at the end. I mean, the stuff about what's the evidence on which you base your probabilities. But there's something very fishy about this. The fact remains that the knowledge norm of assertion prevents you asserting a certain kind of a proposition, allows you to assert a different kind of proposition, where this assertion is going to go wrong much more than that assertion. Seems bad. How am I doing for time? I'll kind of skip through this quickly. So I've been talking about knowledge norm of assertion in raising this general general problem of witnesses transmitting information where that mightn't be as reliable as we'd like. What about the belief norm, the action norm? Belief norm raises all kinds of tricky issues. We need to focus on flat-out belief, not belief of a certain degree, not even belief of a very high degree, but somehow a different category of attitude, flat-out belief. And you might well wonder, do we really want to have flat-out beliefs as part of our rational repertoire? What use is there for flat-out beliefs? And there's quite a lot of debate about this, and some people think that you need flat-out beliefs because you can't keep on computing probabilities all the time. You have to regard some matters as settled. I might talk later about some special cases where social interactions require you to regard flat-out beliefs as settled. But let's suppose, for the sake of the argument, that sometimes it is appropriate to form flat-out beliefs, and now you've got the same question as I've been asking already. How can it be a good idea to ban flat-out beliefs in the 1 chance in a million case of being wrong, but allow them in the 1 chance in 10,000? Action norms raise a lot more complications, and in fact action norms are, if you ask me, not as plausible, not as defensible as the norms of assertion and belief. I mean, as I put it, while it's not crazy, though I've been raising deep worries about it, it's not crazy to bar the assertion of, or the flat-out belief in lottery claims because they're just statistical evidence. It's clearly crazy to bar taking into account the 1 in a million likelihood of the lottery proposition as far as action goes. I mean, I mentioned Hawthorne and Stanley saying you shouldn't just throw the ticket away because the thought it won't win when you don't know it won't win. But suppose somebody offers you £50 for your £1 ticket. I mean, doesn't the thought that then it won't win, shouldn't that be relevant to your choice? And in fact, the defenders of knowledge norms immediately have to backtrack and start saying, oh, we need to bring in knowledge of probabilities or knowledge of impedances and so on to stop you refusing the £50 because you don't know your ticket won't win. And I think that the action norm really isn't going to be defensible. It's a kind of dilemma. I mean, Hawthorne and Stanley start off their paper by saying most people think that the rationality of action is a matter of utility maximization, but that can't be right because somebody who throws away their ticket on the grounds it won't win can't be criticized in terms of utility maximization, but they are criticizable. But then they have to start adding bells and whistles to stop them ending up doing stupid things like refusing the £50. And the dilemma I think they face is either the bells and whistles do the trick, in which case the original dismissal of utility maximization is undermined, or they don't do the trick, in which case they ended up recommending silly choices. So maybe we should be focusing on the knowledge norms of assertion and belief more than action, because they're more defensible. Okay, we've had the defense of knowledge norms in terms of lottery propositions. We've had the problem that this seems to land us with. Given the problem, you might expect the defenders of the knowledge norms to say a bit more. I mean, what's so good about knowledge such that we can kind of assert when we've likely got knowledge, even if we can't assert when we've much more likely got truth? What's so good about knowledge so as to warrant that asymmetry? But strangely, the defenders of knowledge norms tend not to say anything about that at all. Their defense of knowledge norms tends not to. I mean, we mentioned Williamson struck me as a rather sophistic argument, but the defense of knowledge norms mostly hinges on appeals to intuition, appeals to what it strikes us as the right thing to do. It appeals to everyday intuitions about what you ought to do in these different cases. And I don't think this is really at all adequate. I mean, it's possible that these folk intuitions are onto something that really is something bad about asserting lottery propositions, and the badness goes away when we have a witness or something like that. It's possible that the folk are onto something, but the friends of knowledge do nothing to show that they are, and do nothing to rule out the possibility that the folk intuitions are just mistaken about what's a good thing to do. I've got a slide here which just gives you the flavor. We already had this quote from Williamson. He doesn't say that it's a bad thing to say the ticket won't win. He says intuitively my grounds are inadequate. He's just appealing to intuitions here. No argument as to why it's bad. Just appeals to our intuitions that this is a bad thing. Hawthorne and Stanley. Our ordinary folk appraisals suggest that the concept of knowledge is intertwined with the rationality of action. Well, I mean, they suggest it, but, I mean, is that an argument? Hawthorne appeals to what's natural to say in English. Declan Smithies, kind of slightly more epicyclic version of these knowledge norms. You've got a justified knowledge rule. But he takes the task of the epistemologist here to be giving the best explanation of all the intuitive data, all people's intuitive reactions to what you ought to do in these cases. And I just don't think this is the right way to go about deciding what's the right way to think and act. Here's an analogy. Think about the work in the heuristics and biases tradition. Kahneman and Tversky, Nisbet and Ross, and so on. I mean, as we're all familiar with, this experimental behavioral economic work shows that people are highly prone to engage in irrational forms of thinking. People are very prone to affirm the consequent, to ignore base rates, to be probabilistically incoherent. I mean, those are the standard examples, in fact, relevant to what I'm talking about today. There's some less well-known studies showing that people have a strong preference for beliefs based on causal contact with the facts rather than on bare statistical evidence. Now, when this stuff first came out, they prompted, I don't know if anybody here can remember, a rationality debate. And there were people who said it's not possible for these psychologists to be showing that people's ordinary intuitions about rationality are mistaken. L. Jonathan Cohen in Oxford, I mean, there was some fancy stuff about performance competence distinctions, but his thought was the norms of rationality are simply a distillation of what humans find intuitively proper reasoning. So how can what humans naturally and intuitively do turn out to be irrational? But nobody, I mean, this debate went on for a little bit, but I think the consensus very quickly was that Jonathan Cohen's view was just not serious. Look, the purpose of theoretical reasoning, we're consequentialists about theoretical reasoning, it's to generate and preserve truth, and of practical reasoning to maximize objectively expected value. And if everyday intuitions about what's the right way to think and act favor ways of reasoning that don't conduce to those outcomes, well, so much the worse for everyday intuition. I mean, I don't need to push the thought that we can all see that affirming the consequent is not a good thing to do, even if it seems natural to many people. The moral of the analysis is, if it seems natural to many people, they ought to train themselves so it doesn't seem natural anymore, and they ought to train themselves to do differently, which is, in fact, if you think about it, what we all do. That's what we send our kids to school for 20 years to do, to learn to do the probabilistic sums right, not affirm the consequent, and so on. So I have the same attitude to norms of knowledge as pretty much everybody has to the irrational tendencies that Kahneman and Tversky and others exposed. The norms of knowledge I think of as everyday intuitions that encourage us to think irrationally. I mentioned that a kind of sub-theme in the heuristics and biases tradition is that ordinary people have a strong preference for beliefs based on causal contact with the facts. That you've got an eyewitness or somebody that come and somebody goes and looks at the winning ticket and so on. They prefer beliefs based on that and don't like beliefs based on pure statistical evidence. And I mean, the literature in the behavioral psychology tradition just takes this as another example of everyday irrationality. I think we can actually say more about why that specific bias, what its source is. And I think the problem is the concept of knowledge. So, this is theory of mind, false belief test kind of stuff. I mean, it's a complicated area. Children can't pass a false belief test till they're 3, but they pass an implicit false belief test much earlier, and can animals? But let me tell the simple old story, which is that children and animals have no difficulty early on with the distinction between people who are acquainted with some fact, they're open to the fact, the simplest case is where line of sight. There's nothing in between me and Francisco's shirt, so I know what colour Francisco's shirt is. Somebody who's got a screen in between them, they don't know. Animals and children are very happy about that distinction. The fact kind of causes you to have to be au fait with it, or you'll prevent it. And it's only much later that we develop the idea of people having a belief that P, as opposed to knowing that P. Now we distinguish among the people who don't know that P, those who are just ignorant agnostic, and those who have a false belief. And that's very useful, because then we're able to anticipate the people who have a false belief, act just like the people who know, though of course they won't succeed in their projects because their belief is false. But bringing in the idea of beings being like the knowers, despite the fact not being present, vastly increases our ability to anticipate other people's behavior. It also, once we have the idea of belief, as well as just knowledge, contact with the fact, then we can appreciate that sometimes a belief can be true, not by accident, very probably true, even though we don't have the kind of contact that is there in the primitive, simple cases of knowledge. I mean, my belief that my ticket won't win isn't caused by contact with the winning ticket, as it is if I read in the newspaper. It's just based on abstract statistical reasoning. But for all that, it's very likely to be true. So now we're in a position to appreciate that beliefs can be true and not by accident, even though they aren't cases of knowledge. So the idea here is that knowledge involves some kind of causal contact with the fact at issue. I mean, you can make it more sophisticated. I mean, somebody else can see it and they can come and tell me, and there's change of testimony, but that's a kind of contact with the fact at issue being transmitted to you, and it's different from the case where you arrive at the belief by abstract reasoning involving statistical evidence. Now, the latter case, the belief is just as likely to be true, and you should rely on it, you should act on it, but it's not the good kind of basic case, and we have a gut feeling that there's something missing there. There's something inferior about pure statistical evidence compared with the primitive notion of causal contact that children and animals have from a very early age. And so we feel that there's something low-grade about beliefs based on pure statistical evidence. We shouldn't assert them, we shouldn't believe them, we shouldn't act on them, but I say there's no serious basis for this attitude. It's just a kind of everyday intuition grounded in the familiarity, the basicness of the archaic category of knowledge, the category that we and our ancestors all had before we were sophisticated enough to think about beliefs. Okay, so that's what I think about knowledge norms. They're a mistake based on primitive thinking. Okay, I've got say 10 minutes because I've got quite a lot more to say, but now this is where I'm not so confident. So friends of knowledge who have come with me this far, they now will try a different tack. And I have colleagues at King's College London, Clayton Littlejohn, Julian Detente, Scott Sturgeon is a friend of mine, and they're all kind of in the knowledge is important business. And they say, why are you so quick to dump on this attachment that people have to being in contact with the facts? You've agreed that people value being in contact with the facts rather than arriving at a belief by abstract statistical reasoning. Who am I to say that this thing that people value is of no value at all? No, maybe it's not crucial for consequentialist utility maximization and getting at truth, but people like being in contact with the facts. And after all, what's the grounds of ultimate value? I mean, one doesn't have to be too relativist to say that somehow it stems from what is important for evolved human beings. So maybe there's something important in itself about being in contact with the facts, gripping the facts, as Scott Sturgeon puts it to me. Okay, there are cases where this thought can be backed up quite strongly. Okay, here's a different issue. This is actually the issue that got me into this whole topic of knowledge norms. But this is an issue that people debate a lot in a quite separate area, the philosophy of law. Issue of statistical evidence in the law. Okay, here's the classic case. 100 prisoners in a prison yard, at a signal, 99 of them attack the guard. There's one guy who's knows nothing of the plan, is innocent, and so on. And now you have in the dock in front of you in the court one of these 100. And that's all you know. And let's set it up so you can't find out anything else. And, right, can you send this guy down for attacking the warder? And everybody thinks, and so does legal precedent, no, you can't. You can't convict on bare statistical evidence. It would be wrong. Nothing discriminates this person from the one innocent person. You can't send them down. And there's a huge amount of discussion about why this is such a compelling legal principle. Is that 5 minutes? Yeah, okay. And no, this is just like the lottery case. So now, what's puzzling about this is there are plenty of cases in the court where you have an eyewitness. Eyewitness says, I saw them do it. I mean, it doesn't quite fit this case, but eyewitness says, I saw this person steal a necklace from the shop. And we know eyewitnesses are very unreliable. Eyewitnesses, at best, I mean, you can look at statistics, but at best, they'll be right 9 times in 10. But in that case, we have no problem about thinking it's okay to convict the person. And sure, I mean, 1 time in 10 we're going to make a mistake, but nothing terrible about convicting on the basis of eyewitnesses, as there is about convicting on the basis of pure statistical evidence. Now, the philosophers of the law, I mean, there's a huge literature trying to figure out what's the rationale here. And it's not very satisfying. My colleague Clayton Littlejohn, I think, absolutely puts his finger on it. He says that the principle driving us is we can't convict when we don't know. And in the case of bare statistical evidence, just like lottery proposition, we sure don't know. It's certain that we don't know. With an eyewitness, it's quite likely we do know. 9 chances in 10 that we know. So it's okay to convict there. I mean, 1 time in 10 it'll go wrong, but in the case of statistical evidence, it's certain that we don't know. Okay, and at first pass, I'm going to say just the same thing about this as I said about the lottery and the newspaper and so on. Can this be right? I mean, if our aim is to convict the innocent and convict the guilty and free the innocent, it can't make sense to refuse to convict at a very high probability and be happy to convict at a lower probability. If what we're after is just freeing the innocent and convicting the guilty, something has gone wrong. And so I say it's again our primitive attachment to the notion of knowledge is leading us astray here. But Clayton says, no, you've got the ends wrong. You've got wrong what we're trying to achieve. What's important to us is not just to free the innocent and convict the guilty. It's also important to us in itself that we don't convict people when we don't know that they're guilty. So, I mean, here's a decision tree. I've got a little guilty, innocent, convict, free, and you can see it's really bad to convict an innocent person, but when the probabilities are high enough, then you will do a conviction. But Clayton has among the ends that you do not convict when guilt is not known. He thinks that's a very, very bad thing. It's somehow sinful to send the guy from the prison yard to jail just on bare statistical evidence. And so he says, in the case where you've got bare statistical evidence, you know you're on the right-hand side of his decision tree, and so freeing the prisoner is dominant. In the case of the eyewitness, it's a good chance that you're over on the left-hand side, and so you can make a conviction. Okay, I better stop in a sec. So, I'm not sure about the courts. I'm not sure that the court shouldn't be just concerned with freeing the innocent, and they should be happy with bare statistical evidence. But there are other cases. What about personal interactions? Here's an analogue. Your spouse starts buying you clothes, going to the hairdresser, you read in a psychology magazine that 99% chance they're having an affair. Can you blame them for having an affair? It seems to me quite right in that you can't blame them for having an affair. I mean, some acquaintance tells you that they saw them with somebody else in a restaurant late at night. Now you can blame them. But even though in this case, my intuitions, I'm happy to stay with my intuitions. I think it's maybe, well, I'm not sure, but it's maybe important to our social fabric that we don't go around blaming people, having reactive attitudes, unless we know about the grounds for the blame. So maybe here's a place where knowledge is important. Maybe our social fabric is knitted together by the idea that people that you're loyal to, you don't start blaming them unless you have this kind of grip on the facts. You can't do it. I don't care. But okay, I'd better stop by there. I think this is a very special case. It now turns out that knowledge is important just for the social fabric of friendship, close personal relationships, maybe for, if you think of the courts as an extension of that, maybe there too. But it's not important when it comes to decisions about other matters, such as what to do with lottery tickets, whether to drive your car this afternoon. I have an example involving a medical procedure, but I'll leave that to one side and just end with the thought that any value attaching to knowledge is restricted to special legal and emotional contexts, and so we should refuse to conform to any generally applicable norms apply in other contexts that require us to respect knowledge. And that's it. I'll stop there.